grant you that. Put your hands in the air. Puff up your chest and you celebrate chest. The children laugh and the children clap. Everybody know True. Everybody know him around the show.
Give Ray, just show another bit of appreciation for his performances for us. So, as I said, we're Books and Beyond, we're at Swiss Cottage Library, and we're exploring Windrush 2021 and using The Lonely Londoners by Samuel Selvon as a launch pad for a conversation about the Windrush, what it meant then, and what it means for us here today. Just a bit about Sam Selvon. He was a Trinidadian writer, recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship Award for exceptional creativity in the arts. He's got honorary doctorates from Warwick University and the University of West Indies, as well as a recognition from Canada. And posthumously, he's been awarded several national medals for his contribution to Trinidad and Tobago's literary tradition. Now, I'm really excited that we're actually using Lonely Londoners to start off this conversation, because I did say to Moira, our head of Libraries, Arts and Tourism, I think quite early on in the spring, that when we were talking about which book should we use, and Andrea Levy's Small Island was mentioned, and I love that book as well, but I do hold a very special place in my heart for this book, Lonely Londoners, so I'm really glad that we're able to share that today. So I think just to share with you why it's important. First, it chronicles the lives of the first wave of West Indians to arrive in Britain, the constant search for jobs, homes, money, community, meaningful relationships, and the constant drip of racism on daily life. Lonely Londoners was published in 1956 and gives an unforgettable account of the immigrant experience and is one of the great novels of the 20th century. The second reason why it's important is its use of language. Those of you who've read the book, the third person narrator that narrates the story in the same voice as the main protagonists, the main characters, basically using the Caribbean voice, accent and idioms to bring a greater awareness to the diversity and change happening in London at that time. And of course it gives that authentic voice to the lives of the people whose stories are being told. So we're in for a good time this evening, and I'd like to ask the panel to introduce themselves. we did have a think, do I introduce the panel? But actually, since you're all sitting here and you're not with the audience out in Zoom land, it's best that you just say a little bit about yourself and why you're here this evening. So if you start off with Tony Warner.
All right, my name's Tony Warner from Black History Walks. We organise walks, talks and films on London's African history every single month, all year long for the last 14 years now. So there's 12 different walks, North East, South and West London, and we put on films and talks as well.
Thanks, Tony. Welcome.
I'm Jana Ali. I'm a creative and designer from London. I'm Indo-Guyanese, and I merge my creative work with Indo-Caribbean and identity advocacy.
I'm Ray Carlis. You said sex office.
Yeah.
And yeah, child of Windrush parents.
And a long history creating great music for us here in the UK and internationally. So
Okay.
very, very modest, very, very modest. And I'd like to welcome our mayor, who has just joined us. I've put you on the spot, so welcome. We're really glad to have you with us this evening. So just to explain how the program's going to run, we've got a number of readings that will start off the conversation, and most of our I think only one of our readers is here this evening, but they have been videoed. So we'll take in a moment our very first reading, and I'd like to indulge myself a bit, so please do give me this. Before we delve into the exploration of the themes evoked by Lonely Londoners, I really wanted to share with you a perspective from home, from the Caribbean, what it actually looked like and felt like for those people in the Caribbean watching the migration, their fellow country people leaving and coming to England. Now, I'm not a performing poet, so this is really a bit of an indulgence. And although this poem is a poem by Louise Bennett, and she talks about the view from Jamaica, it's a perspective that's shared right across the Caribbean. So just a bit of scene set, colonization in reverse. So what you've got to remember, those of you who may not be so aware, that migrating has been something that's been part of Caribbean history since the late 19th century, people leaving, going to Panama, going to Cuba, going to the States. And in the late 40s, early 50s, the migration started to England. Colonization in reverse. What a joyful news, Miss Matty. I feel like me heart going burst. Jamaica people colonizing England in reverse. By the 100, by the 1,000 from country and from town, by the shipload, by the plane load, Jamaica is England bound. Them a pour out of Jamaica, everybody future plan is to get a big time job and settle in the motherland. What a island, what a people, man and woman, old and young, just a pack them bag and baggage and turn history upside down. Some people don't like travel, but we show them loyalty. Them all a open up cheap fare to England agency. And week by week, them shipping off them countrymen like fire for immigrate and populate the seat of the empire. Wanna see how life is funny? Wanna see the turnabout? Jamaica live for box bread out of English people mouth. What a devilment of England, them face war and brave the worst, but are wondering how them go and stand colonization in reverse. So that's a view from the homelands. So let us focus now on Lonely Londoners. Our first reading we're going to have by Sade Sonia from Small Green Shoots. And this is filmed at Beckford Primary School, where Beryl Gilroy was head teacher, the first black head teacher in London. And many of you will know that Beckford Primary School is changing its name to West Hampstead Primary School from September 2021. So Sade.
at the station in London and help him until he gets settled. The fella's name is Henry Oliver, but the friend tells Moses not to worry, that he described Moses to Henry, and that all he has to do is to be in the station when the boat train pull in, and this fella Henry would find him. So for old time's sake, Moses found himself on the bus going to Waterloo, vexed with himself that his heart so soft that he would always do something for somebody and nobody would ever be doing anything for him. Because it looked to Moses that he hardly has time to settle in Old Britain before all sorts of fellas start coming straight into his room in the water. When they land in London from the West Indies, saying that so-and-so tell them that Moses is a good fella to contact, that he would help them get place to stay and work to do. Jesus Christ, Moses tells Harris, a friend he has, I never seen something so. I don't know these people at all, yet they're coming to me as if I am some liaison officer, and I catch in my arse as it is. How can I help them out? And this sort of thing was happening at a time when the English people started to make a rap about how too many West Indians was coming to the country. This was a time where wherever corner you turn is 10 to 1, you bound to bounce up a shade. There isn't a place where you wouldn't find them. And big discussion going on in Parliament about the situation, though the old Britain too diplomatic to clamp down on the boys or do anything drastic like stopping them from coming to the mother country. But big headlines in the papers every day, and whatever the newspapers and radio say in this country, that is the people Bible. Like one time the newspapers say that the West Indians think that the streets of London paved with gold. A Jamaican fella went to the income tax office to find out something, and the first thing the clerk tell him is, you people think the streets of London are paved with gold? Newspaper and radio rule this country. Now the position have Moses uneasy, because to tell the truth, most of the fellas who come in now are real hustlers, desperate. It is not like long time when 40 or 50 straggling in. They invading the country by hundreds, and when them fellas who here a long time see people running from the West Indies, it's only logic for them to say it would be damn foolishness to go back. So what Moses could do when these fellas land up hopeless on the doorstep with one set of luggage, no place to sleep and no place to go.
Okay, thank you. One set of luggage, no place to sleep, no place to go. So here we are, panel. We, our parents maybe, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, have taken this leap of faith, and we arrive in England with our hopes and our dreams and our one suitcase, our one grip maybe. So what's the environment that we're coming into at that time? I mean, who wants to kind of see set for us?
The boat trains would often end up at Paddington. So if you're coming from the Caribbean, you're taking a boat's taking 2 weeks to come here. And sometimes the boat is actually going to Italy, and you're catching a train from Italy through Switzerland, through France, and taking the boat train to Waterloo. But other times it comes through Paddington. So Paddington is not far from Notting Hill. And because of World War II servicemen, black people from the Caribbean in World War II, there was a little network in Notting Hill. So people like Baron Baker, who's an ex-RAF veteran, military policeman, and a guy called Toto Baggs would actually go from their place in Blenheim Crescent to Paddington to meet the strays, to meet the people who didn't have no one to meet them. Because remember, it's taking 2 weeks to get here, and if your ship is late or is in a storm or your train is late, you get there from Jamaica, you get to Paddington, and there's no one to meet you because they didn't get the letter or they didn't get the message. So you're just there by yourself in a new country with your 2 suitcases, and where do you go? So what these guys would do, Toto Baggs and Baron Baker, they would go there to meet people, to pick them up, and then bring them back to number 9 Blenheim Crescent, because that was like a halfway house whereby they'd have up to 30 people a night sleeping in the premises, because it'd give them time to then find out where their friends were. So the environment they came into was, a very Actually, it was a hostile environment. That was one part of it. But also, it's a brand new environment. They weren't used to the UK. They weren't used to London. They weren't used to chimneys and houses all squeezed together and all the clouds and the unpleasant weather. So it was a real culture shock. But there was organised people here who actually made the best of it to try actually welcome people to this new environment and help them out. And those guys are just some of them.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, I remember talking to my grandparents and my great aunt about when they came to London. And I think in their heads, they were so conditioned that this is the motherland and that this is going to be an amazing opportunity for them, and perhaps that they'd be more welcomed than they initially thought. And I remember my great aunt saying something that resonated with me, and I don't think she knew exactly what it meant at the time, but she said that when she, the first thought that she had when she stepped down onto London soil was, this weather is miserable. And for me, I feel like that meant so much more than what she thought it meant, because to me, that was metaphorically almost the realization that this is not going to be what you think it's going to be. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be roses. It's not going to be that beautiful sunshine that you have in Guyana. It's going to be hard. And I think that dawning of that weather was a huge symbol of, oh my gosh, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. But I know specifically for the Indo-Caribbean community, when coming here, it was a bit of a challenge for them because a lot of other Caribbean islands hadn't received Indians, indentured laborers. And so when they came and migrated to the UK, they often felt isolated because suddenly islands, say, like Barbados, had not really seen them as part of them. And so they weren't embraced into the Caribbean culture like they were back home. And likewise, with the same as the South Asian community, they kind of didn't understand how these people didn't know their ancestry, or the fact that they were in the Caribbean, that they must have mixed with other races, and to them, at that time, was a no-go. So they didn't embrace the Indo-Caribbeans, and as a result of that, they felt very isolated. And then obviously they were challenged with the model minority myth, which kind of kept them talking out against racism, and they began to create institutionalized activities, like the Muslim Indo-Caribbean community created their own mosques, which are still standing today, which I would urge people to go to because it's this beautiful environment you step into, and there's a sea of melanin, and on the outside it looks like everyone's South Asian, and you get to talking to someone and you hear a sweet Caribbean accent, and the food that they serve are curries and rotis, but Caribbean curries and rotis. So I know that the awakening that they kind of felt was a strong one.
Thank you.
I won't say much, but I'd just like to say that how unselfish that generation of people were. Although, there's these stories about people talking about the streets are paved with gold, but most of them came here. They didn't forget who they left behind. And I've heard so many stories of, just one person who sent for his uncle, his brother, his cousin, you just work hard. You could have worked hard and banked all that money, but he was working hard and he was bringing up people one by one, So I think sometimes we don't see that. We forget that, and we think that we just come here creating just for ourselves. It wasn't that at all. It was a community thing.
Absolutely. My experience, my father came from Crofts Hill in Clarendon in Jamaica, and I think the whole of Crofts Hill, a particular generation, must have landed up in Wolverhampton. Because everybody seemed to absolutely know anyone, and people would just, the lonely Londoners, sometimes you read it and it seems very much kind of a London experience, but when you speak to Caribbean communities outside of London, it's replicated, and the smaller the area that people came from, the more that people then seem to congregate in the same place. So you would turn up, and somebody would give you a room. And I remember my father's experience of coming here early 20s and talking about, they stayed with a very, very good friend from Crofts Hill, but they were all living in this house as young boys, young men together, and the bed shift, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. You know, you have people working days, so they slept in the beds at night, and those who were doing the night shift had the same beds during the day, and that whole pattern of supporting each other until people became established. And I think one of the things, just to explore with you a bit more, is about this whole Windrush area, which is era bookended by the 1948 Nationality Act and then the 1973 Act, and that whole period being seen as the Windrush era in terms of people kind of coming and going. And I remember when I was growing up and hearing about the Windrush, I always thought that it was just the people who came over on the Windrush and a couple of boats. I didn't even realise there were any other boats, but it just shows how limited my life experience was in Wolverhampton, because I thought the Caribbean was Jamaica. That's all I knew, until I grew up and realised it's not that big. So is there anything else that you want to share about the environment that people were coming into at that time?
Well, obviously, I found it hard to get housing, because at that time you had signs that said no blacks, no dogs, Irish. And if you did get a place to rent, you, as a black person, would be paying 2 or 3 times the rent to stay in that premises. And you probably would not have a bathroom in the premises. At that time, most bathrooms, if you had a bathroom, most toilets, if you had a toilet, would be at the back of the premises in a separate area. So if you want to have a bath, you had to leave your house and go to the public baths. That was quite normal. If you wanted to go to the toilet, sometimes the toilet would be outside, so that was another issue. And then think about this: if you come from the Caribbean, how often would you have a shower a day? Would it be once or twice, or maybe not at all? Like twice, it depends who you are, of course, right? But here's the thing: so you come from the Caribbean, from St. Lucia, Dominica, etc. You come to England now, and you find there's no bathroom in your house, and the average person in the area is going to have a bath at the public baths once a week. So you have to kind of deal with that huge culture shock that you're coming to the mother country and you're used to having a bath, maybe a shower rather, at least once a day, and then the people you're living with are, if you have white friends living with you, are having a bath once a week. And that was a big issue for many people. That's not really discussed too much, but that's one aspect of the experience.
That's just following on from that. I think the thing to say about those slipper baths is that, as Tony said, you go into the public baths, but actually you'd have the water set for you, so you couldn't run as much water as you wanted, and you'd buy a little piece of soap, and you'd have the water set for you, and you'd be timed to go in there, have your bath, and come out. So an absolute, as you say, an absolute shock.
Some people would actually buy like a tin bath and have it on the landing or in their room, and then fill it with hot water that they boiled in a kettle, and the kettle was boiled on a gas stove on the landing. It wasn't like a proper kitchen, depending on what property you're in, but that was quite another weird experience. If you come from the Caribbean, it was very, very odd to be doing that kind of thing.
Does anyone in the audience have any experience that they want to share? The bed sharing. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Abel. There's that common experience from the kind of, that migrant experience. Just another kind of question for kind of panel members here. The West Indies, it's a place on a map, and people were called West Indians, but for many people who came, their experience of meeting, and I think Jana, you was referencing this, people from other islands was quite new. And I just wanted to explore that a bit more with you.
I think the history of the Caribbean is so complex. I think there's more races in the Caribbean than people really know. I mean, I always think that the Indo-Caribbean community is underrepresented, but so many other people don't know about the Sino-Caribbean community, which are the Chinese laborers that came over during indentureship. The Portuguese community, there's so many different communities, but it's what each island kind of encountered. So the Indo-Caribbean community predominantly came to Guyana and Trinidad. And then there were a few, like, for example, there were some that went to Jamaica, but the language used around Indo-Caribbeans are completely different in different areas of the Caribbean. So because the Windrush had a heavy Jamaican presence when they came over, the word coolie is used so differently than how it is used in Guyana and Trinidad. So here, for Jamaicans, because a lot of people mixed with Indo-Caribbeans, and you would point out when someone had more of an Indian look, so you would say that person's coolie, which means you were mixed with Indo-Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean. Whereas in Guyana and Trinidad, because the races were kept quite separate, because of the nature of indentured servitude and kind of what the British were kind of trying to do with the divide and conquer tactic, the word is used very differently. It's purely just used for people or descendants of indentured servitude. So when you come here and you're an Indo-Caribbean person or descendant being brought up in London or Britain, and you hear that word being thrown around in a completely different way than you're used to hearing it, it can almost somehow erase your identity a bit because of the way in which it's used. And for a long time when I was growing up, I only ever heard it in the context of, oh, you're mixed with Afro-Caribbean and Indo-Caribbean. And trying to even establish the concept of Indo-Caribbean for some people is quite confusing. So trying to understand that word for others is even more confusing. So yeah, I think it's completely very normal for people not to understand the history of the Caribbean and how the migration patterns have worked.
Okay, thanks, Jana. Anybody else want to come in before we go to the next clip?
Just probably say I can imagine that all these people coming from different islands meeting up and with different accents, you know, there would have been communication problems and probably caused divisions, as Trinidad, Biajan, you know, etc. But when, in the scheme of things, when problems beset them and they were being attacked by Skinners and stuff, they came together, you know. And I think the Skinners did this a big favor, you know. Yeah.
In terms of, yeah, absolutely. And if we look back at that period, 1940s, 1950s, the riots that happened at that time were quite kind of seminal. I wonder, Tony, if you want to say anything about that.
I would just remind people that, you know, in the 40s and 50s, there's not much inter-island travel communication because, you know, there's no LIAT, there's no planes going between St. Lucia and Barbados, whatever. It's only like a schooner, and you won't be on a schooner unless you're a sailor, so there's not that much communication between the black communities in the Caribbean. So for a lot of them, when they came here, that's the first time they met a Dominican or a Trinidad, etc. So that was a surprise for them. But that also happened in World War II as well, because a lot of the guys who volunteered to serve the mother country, so to speak, had never met another Caribbean person until they were in the Air Force, and then they met all these other guys. And also, it links into a bit about how people came to settle in certain areas. So because you had this association with Jamaica or St. Lucia, etc., when you came here and you meant to meet your friend would be a St. Lucian most of the time. So you found that you'd got developments of Trinidadians in Notting Hill and Jamaicans in Brixton and then Bajans in Reading because of the fact that you follow your friends. And then that links into, I suppose, housing, because after having to rent from a racist landlord for a certain period of time and being ripped off and having to use the outside toilet, etc. Because sometimes they'd actually lock off the bath, you know. If there was a bath in the actual premises, the landlord would often, put chains on it so you couldn't actually use it. Anyhow, so rather than pay rent to a racist landlord, people said, let's just try and buy our own property. But at that time, the banks would be racist and they would not lend money to Jamaicans. You went there. In fact, some people couldn't even open an account. I know somebody who was from Westbourne Grove, and they went to open an account in Westbourne Grove, and they were told, we don't open accounts in Jamaicans because you don't have to look after your money. So she had to go home and bring her Jamaican bank book to this person in the bank to prove she could actually do that, and then she was allowed to open the bank account. Anyway, so when it came to buying a house, you got racist discrimination from the banks. Therefore, how would you actually buy a house? Well, there's something called a partner or a boxer or a susu. So a boxer and partner susu is the same thing. It's basically you get 10 people from the same, normally the same area, same village, or same island for sure, and you all agree to put down, let's say, £100 per week. At the end of the first week, one person gets £1,000. Next week, one person gets £1,000. It goes around the 10 people. And at that time, back in 50s, 60s, you could actually buy a 4-bed house in Brixton, Nottingham for £1,000, £3,000. You could actually do that. So by using the partner system, people were able to buy properties and own those properties, and therefore avoid being discriminated against in the rental market. It then meant that, let's say I'm from Barbados, I just bought this house in Notting Hill, and I'm 21 years old, and I have a 4-bedroom house. What am I going to do with it? Am I going to just live there by myself, or am I going to say, listen, my brethren, come here and pay me some rent, and you can live with me too, and avoid discrimination. So after a while, you have this development of, certain Caribbean communities in certain areas. As I said before, it could be Bajans in Reading, it could be Trinidadians in Nottingham, it could be Jamaicans in Brixton. But as far as this community is concerned, the white community is concerned, they're just all black people. So they just see a whole bunch of black people. But what would also happen is that if you did buy a property in a certain area, like say Brixton, for example, your white neighbor might think, oh, I can't have black neighbors, let me move out. Let me move someplace else. So the house next door is not empty. What do? You can either buy it yourself using the same partner system, or say to your friend, listen, house next door is empty, why do you use a partner and buy it too? And that's what we got the development of African Caribbean communities in certain areas across the country. And of course that links into rights, but it's another story, so I'll stop talking now.
Thanks. There's this lovely piece in the novel Lonely Londoners in the first chapter where Moses, our main person, goes to Waterloo to meet the boat train. And he's approached by a journalist who wants to do a piece on the amount of West Indians moving into the country. But he wants to interview a Jamaican. It's that point that you're making. As far as the white community, the host community was concerned, everybody was the same. So you had, there's a really funny scene whereby you have a Trinidadian, which Moses is, who then makes out that he's a Jamaican because he's being interviewed. And the journalist wanting to take a particular line, a particular thing about the amount of people who are coming here. And he then interviews people who've come off the boat and the family that are there, but he's not getting the story that he wants. And so he walks away. He walks away because it's about perpetuating a particular perception to the wider British community about West Indians, black people moving into this country. So I'm going to move us on to our second reading, which is being read for us by Carol Nelson, one of our teams, and she's actually sitting in the audience today. So she can wave. So I think we've got you on screen.
And Galahad watched the colour of his hands and talked to it, saying, "Colour, it's you causing all this, you know. Why the hell can't you be blue or red or green if you can't be white? You know it's you that cause a lot of misery in the world. It's not me, you, no, it's you. I ain't doing anything to infuriate the people and them. It's you. Look at you. You're so black and innocent. And this time you're causing misery all over the world." So Galahad, talking to the colour black as if it is a person, telling it that it is not he who's causing botheration in the world, but black, who's a worthless thing for making trouble all about. Black, you see what you caused to happen yesterday? I went to look at a room that Ram told me about in the gate, And as soon as the landlady see you, she said the room let already. She ain't even give me a chance to say good morning. Why the hell can't you change colour? Galahad gets so interested in this theory about black that he went to tell Moses. It's not we that the people don't like, he tell Moses. It's the colour black. But the day he went to Moses with his theory, Moses was in an evil mood because a new friend did just get into a thing with some white fellas in Prague Street near Paddington Station. The friend standing up there reading in the window about rooms to let and things to sell, and it had a notice saying, "Keep the water white." And right there, the friend just started to get on ignorant. Poor fella, he was new in London and want to get in a big argument with the white people standing around. So Moses tell Galahad, take it easy, that is a sharp theory. Why don't you write about it? Anyway, all thought like that, out of Galahad's mind, as he went out on his summer evening, walking down the Bayswater Road on his way to the circus.
No dogs, no Irish. That was something I grew up hearing constantly as one of those things that my parents would and their friends would reference. No vacancies, keeping the water, keeping Bayswater white. So exploring the theme around kind of daily racism and the impact on individuals and communities, and that whole idea of blackness and how that's shifted from that time to now. Really welcome your thoughts on that.
Something I always remember is my dad telling me that when he was growing up, his parents used to tell him that, unfortunately, you're going to experience racism. It's the nature of coming here as a migrant. But one thing you have the ability to educate yourself and to build up yourself so that they can't tear that down about you. And I think that's one thing that he's always said to me as well. But listening to that piece, I remember this book, The Lonely Londoner, written by an Indo-Caribbean person, which I don't think a lot of people actually realize. This was the first fact-based fiction book that I read when I really wanted to get to know my identity. And that part really resonates because it's just so upsetting to hear that someone has to completely disconnect their identity from the tone of their skin to kind of show how trivial almost it looks to them when they're receiving the abuse. That the one thing you don't like about me is the color of my skin. You don't care about how I'm perfectly nice to you, I'm funny, I'm approachable. The one thing that will stop you from talking to me, stop me from getting housed, stop me from accessing clean water, being bathed, is the color of my skin. And that trivial kind of the way it's presented so that it's so almost so stupid, so dumb, like what a stupid concept, It really makes me so upset to hear that, but it makes me think about the things that my grandparents had to tell my dad, and how my dad, even to this day, has to tell me. And I'm in a privileged position, even, but has to tell me to kind of make it seem like they're silly, So that's kind of what I think about when I hear that.
Well,
Thanks,
how do we deal with racism? We have in different ways. One of my heroes is an uncle. He's passed now. He used to go to America to work in the cane fields and stuff like that, and he was deeply religious. But when he went to America and he saw the segregation, and he kind of lost it because he didn't say, well, are these people in a church and black people can't sit next to white people? So when he came here, his character changed, and he was kind of, he could have been like a heavyweight champion, and he would find himself on on the building site. He was a builder, and it was a builder plumber. But he would be in the building site, and when the white folks would take the mickey or do the banter thing, he really didn't have much patience, you know. So I use this little story on my gigs when I'm playing there's one particular song that we play. The song's called Knockout Punch. And that's how my Uncle Ken used to deal with the banter and the racism. Just one left-hander. Just knockout punch one time.
Send them flat.
Yeah.
I can give you a couple examples of the levels of discrimination people face now they overcame it. So there's a guy called Cy Grant. Cy Grant is from Ghana. He was in the RAF aircrew navigator. He flew missions over Germany. He got shot down, 2 years in a prison war camp. So 2 years in prison war camp, comes back to UK and graduates as a barrister. So he's a barrister, World War II hero, RAF, etc. Guess what? Can't get no job. So he ends up becoming the first black man to sing the news on the BBC. It was called The Tonight Show, a guy called Cliff Mitchellmore. And because he can't get a job as a barrister, despite being a war hero, have a qualification, he goes into entertainment. And he becomes the first black guy to sing news on the BBC in 1957. So that's one example of someone who should have been able to get a job, but because of discrimination didn't get a job, but then overcame it by becoming the first black guy on TV. There's another guy called E.R. Bradford. E.R. Bradford was also from Ghana, and he was a Spitfire pilot. This guy's a Spitfire pilot, RAF, World War II, etc. And he has a master's degree in physics from Cambridge. So physics degree from Cambridge, Spitfire pilot, World War II hero, etc. Guess what? Can't get no job. And he's really feels sorry for himself, and he decides to apply for a job as a teacher in a rough mashup secondary school in East London, which he gets. And it's well beneath his skill level, but that's a job he chooses to take because he wants a job, he wants to work, wants to get and earn some money. So as a teacher there in East London, in this rough mashed up school, he has to teach these kids who are really racist and also don't want to learn. And he spends like a couple of years there, and he keeps a diary of his experiences. And when he leaves the school, he actually publishes that diary as a book that may be here even. The book is called To Sir With Love by E.R. Bradford. And that book became a best-selling novel, was translated to 20 different languages, became a movie with Sidney Poitier playing E.R. Bradford, the real person. And I think people if they watched the film, they don't always recognize that it was E.R. Bradford from Ghana, who is actually the character being played by Sidney Poitier, but that's an example of a guy who was extremely, talented, but had to overcome these blocks in his way, and then went to become a professor in New York of English, I think it was. So he's a real legend. But and again, linking it back into what my man over here just said about the physical response. There were Ku Klux Klan groups in this country, in London, in South London, and it was a civil rights group, I forget the name now, but they had to actually patrol parts of South London to protect people from the Klan who would beat them up on the streets in South London. I forget the name of them, but it's in a book called Thinking Black by Dr. Rob Waters. There's another group in West London that was based at number 9 Blenheim Crescent. Now, Baron Baker, the guy I mentioned before, Baron Baker, the ex-RAF veteran, he was aware of these racial attacks in Notting Hill because these white guys were driving from Shepherd's Bush purely to attack black people. And Baron Baker said, we're not going to have that. So he actually organized a self-defense group to patrol that area of mostly ex-servicemen who he knew. And on top of that, when they had the Notting Hill racist riots, or the riots of, anti-black riots, I should say, Baron Baker actually organized for people to meet in number 9 Blenheim Crescent and come out at night to fight these people. But not only that, guys from Brixton were driving up each night in August, September, to support their brothers and sisters in Notting Hill. So those riots were caused by black people being attacked and actually coming out to defend themselves and actually beating and kicking out these white racist people. But when you hear about those riots, they're often described just as riots as if people just went mad in the streets, but it was actually organized self-defense of the black community by the black community because the black community has been under attack for about the last 5 years or so.
Thanks for that, Tony. And if we kind of stick with West London, if we stick with the riots in West London and in Nottingham, the big riots in '58, and then we have Claudia Jones in 1959 with the first Caribbean carnival that happened here in Camden, St. Pancras Town Hall. And very often when people talk about that, they talk about it was great, we were just yet having another good time. But actually that event is significant in so many ways because it was also a response to the riots and the racism that was taking place in this country. So it was about communities organising, using the arts, using culture as a way to affirm identity, affirm place, and also to give that greater sense of community.
One of the things that Claude Jones was doing is that she'd actually have a black beauty competition within the carnival, to kind of showcase black beauty, because at that time in the 50s, it was not seen to be beautiful to be black. So she would actually contrast that with these black beauty shows. But also, with the money she made from Carnival, she'd often invest that money in paying the bill of young black men who'd been unfairly arrested and harassed by the police. Because if you remember the sus laws from the 80s, well, it's much worse back in the 50s. So she would actually support black men who'd been unfairly arrested by the police. And on top of that, Carnival wasn't just in London. She'd actually move around the country. So she'd actually take up to Manchester, and it was an international event because she'd get support from the commissioners, she'd get musicians from the Caribbean to come and perform. I think she had the Mighty Sparrow one time. But so she would do a whole bunch of stuff that's not really recognized to showcase, support, and uplift Caribbean people who are here and black culture in general.
And when we think about Claudia Jones, we think about the West Indian Gazette, which she started, working with Amy Ashwood Garvey, wife of Marcus Garvey, and there is something about how we organise. And I have this lovely quote that I want to share with you, where she says, "There are at least 80,000 good reasons why we believe a West Indian newspaper is necessary and welcomed. There are 80,000 odd West Indians now resident here, and together we form a community with our own wants and problems, which our paper will help us to meet." So there is something about kind of culture, creativity, taking ownership and agency of the situation that there are so many examples throughout history. And as we've got a great artist with us, is there anything you'd like to share about how the arts and culture and music has worked in that space in terms of identity for our communities?
Well, I think, the music of the Caribbean has just worked to make this place so much better, interesting. Not just the music, but the general arts come from the Caribbean. And speaking for my dad was a musician. He played the saxophone. But he was also a tailor, so he came here wanted to be a musician, but he had to put this down to look after us, So as did probably many others. So a lot of creativity that came from the Caribbean was flushed away because necessity of people having to look after their family and feed themselves, feed their children. So I know I've gone off of your question, but I just think that without Caribbean music, can you imagine? Sometimes I have to say, if there wasn't this influence of the Caribbean and Africa in the music world, we'd all be crying. We'd be so dry. And even like in the jazz world, the music of the 30s, if it wasn't for the influence of the African Americans in the jazz world, I dread to think that what we'd be listening to.
Yeah, I should also mention the Caribbean Artists Movement. So there's a group called the Caribbean Artists Movement, which included Mr. Selvon, I'm fairly sure, and John LaRose. And these guys were highlighting, promoting, preserving Caribbean culture by having meetings and workshops and book readings. And they would have a regular kind of thing down at the West Indian Student Center in Earl's Court, which is full of, black students. And they do, like as I said, readings and workshops, all that kind of stuff. So they actually preserved a whole bunch of Caribbean culture, and that's what it's called, the Caribbean Artists Movement. And I think No, I think fairly sure that there are archives up at the George Padmore Institute. So that was one part of it. The other part of it that links into music is that if you're black, you couldn't go to a club and hear your kind of music from the mainstream anyway. So what people did is set up their own clubs. So there's a famous club called the Q Club. I don't know if you heard of that guy called Duke Finn, but Duke Finn is a famous sound man. And you would go to the Q Club to hear the sort of music you could only get in the Caribbean, but you get in England if you went to that particular club. But what is not that well known is that when people are in the Q Club and other clubs which are kind of underground in London, hearing Caribbean music and R&B and all, not R&B, what I'm talking about, reggae and calypso and soul, in those same clubs are people like Elton John and the Rolling Stones. So the Q Club, for example, was definitely frequented by Elton John, who would go there to hear black music and then go home and practice on his piano. And same for the Rolling Stones. So some of the influences we have now come directly out of black musicians that were forced underground back in the 50s and 60s.
And it's really important for us to recognise and celebrate that, because the music has transformed the face of British popular music and classical music as well. And so there's a whole other session I think that we can do.
One more thing, I just remembered, because even like the sound system. So we know like carnivals are synonymous with sound systems, and it's an accepted part of British culture, I suppose you could say. But going back in time again now, you had, because you couldn't have your kind of music in a club, that's how sound systems developed. You actually make your own speaker box. You get like a big old wardrobe, you chop it down, you go and nick speakers from the British Rail train station there, and you'd use that to play your tunes, and then you'd have a following. You move all around and all over the country playing your particular vibe. And even the design of those sound systems is an aspect of history and culture that's not recognized, because that's a technological achievement to produce those kind of speakers using someone's old wardrobe. That's like a genius, and it's not really recognized as to how much ingenuity and technology went into producing those sound systems. And that's you can go to a hi-fi shop and buy a 10-inch woofer, whatever, with all the specifications. But back in the 60s, 70s, they had to make that at home in their bedroom. So that's another amazing story that should be better known.
I think there are so many sessions we can have just focusing on the arts and culture. I'm looking in Moira's direction here, because we've just scratched the surface, really. So let's have our third reading, our final reading, and that is from Small Green Shoots. So we've got
Boy, you know what I want to do? I want to go back to Trinidad and lay down in the sun and dig my toes and eat fish broth and go to Marcus Bay and talk to them fishermen, and all day I sleep under a tree with just the old sun for company. You know what I would do if I had money? I'd go and live paradise. You know where paradise is? Somewhere between St. Joseph and Tagia is a small village. One time I had a Portuguese fella named Jesus. He had a run shop, so Ripley had him in Believe It or Not. Jesus had run, shop in paradise. Anyway, up there life was real easy. It would get an old house and have some kettle and go, and all day long sit down in the grass and in the sun. That is life for me, boy. I don't want no ballet and opera and symphony. You know? Galid say. Last year I had a feeling to go back too, but I forgot about it. It ain't have no prospects back home, boy. Sometimes I look back on all the years I spent in Britain, Moses said. And I'm surprised that so many years gone by. Looking at things in general life, really hard for the boys in London. This is a lonely, miserable city. If it was that we didn't get together now and then and talk about things back at home, we would suffer like hell. Here is not home. Here is not home where you have friends and all about. In the beginning, you would think that is a good thing, that nobody minding your business, but after a while you want to get company. You want to go to somebody's house and eat a meal. You want to go to an excursion to the sea. You want to go and play football and cricket. Nobody in London does really accept you. They tolerate you, yes, but you can't go in their house and eat or sit down and talk. It ain't have no sort of family life for us here. Look at Joseph. He married an English girl and they have 4 children and they live in 2 rooms in Paddington. He applied to the LCC for a flat, but it looks like he would never get one. Now the children are big enough to go to school, and what you think? It's big fight every day because the other children call them darky. When they're not at school, they're in the streets playing. But when I was a little fella, my mother cut my tail if I played in the street. And you think Joseph could make out that £6.10 he getting, as it is £10 for me. I feel bad to ask him for it when I meet him. But when I see things like that happening to other people, I decide I would never get married. Look what happened to Lewis, how his wife divorced him. Lewis, look for that. Dumping the woman every night. Yes, but still. And another thing, look how people does dead. Nobody don't know until the milk bottles start piling up in front of their house. Supposing one day I'll kill off here in my room. I don't take regular milk. I would stay here until one of the boys drop round. That is a hell of a thing to think about, you know.
Panel, the theme that I'd really like to explore, launching off from that reading, is around the whole idea of going home, that whole kind of nostalgia of kind of sort of 1 foot here, 1 foot in the Caribbean, possibly 1 foot somewhere on the African continent, maybe another foot in America, maybe a foot in India. That whole sort of psyche of living in 2 places, that kind of either push from here because you don't feel totally accepted, but also the pull of home. So I'd really like to just, for you to unpack what that evokes for you.
I should just mention briefly that part of the Windrush story is that some people went back, you know. So think about 58. There was these riots, racist riots in West London. Some people said, what am I doing there? Let me go back home. And they actually went home. And that carried on throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s. People just said, I've had enough of this racism, let me go back to my country. And that story is not that well known at all. That a lot of people actually said, I had enough, let me go home. The other thing I should mention about home and movement and travel is that when people from the Caribbean were coming in the 50s, 60s on the boats, they were paying like £75. I think it was £75 to come here. And when they came in, they were often given a hard time. At the same time, there were people from England going to live in Australia, and they're paying £10. Now, Australia is twice as far from here as the Caribbean. So you have black World War II veterans paying 60 quid to come here and then being abused until to go out where they came from. Meanwhile, you have a whole bunch of white British people leaving here on subsidized travel, paying £10 to go and live in Australia as immigrants, at the same time as people here are being told, you need to go back where you came from because you're taking our jobs away, even though there's like 1.3 million jobs that were going spread after World War II. The other thing about, you mentioned getting a flat, and the fact is up until 1984, Hackney Council was being racially discriminatory against black people when it came to council housing. So that's when the CRE, Commission for Racial Equality, came in and actually said, Hackney Council is racist when it comes to housing, and you need to change the whole system. And that was Hackney Council in 1984. So you can imagine what the other councils are doing, because they're all doing the same sort of thing. So that kind of shows you how persistent the discrimination is, that even in the 80s, you're having a whole council putting black people in the worst mashed up accommodation they can offer. And that began to change because of the CRE investigation in 1984, and that led to a change around the entire country. But yeah, that's great, because that's something there about the kind of, what was it like here that in a sense caused, which acted almost like a push for people to make choices and go home or go to the States. I had an uncle who, just as you say at that point, who got so fed up with things here, he then went to the States. Now, the States isn't necessarily the best place to be, but he went and made a life in the States. And one of the things that he said when I met up with him in Jamaica was actually it was near to home. So it was much easier to get back to Jamaica from New York than it is from here. Yeah, and don't forget that at the time, 50s, 60s, 70s, it's expensive to go to Jamaica or the Caribbean as a whole. So you might come here in 61, and then you can't go and see your mum, dad, or your granny died, whatever, until, well, you can't go because you can't afford it. So that was another big problem for a lot of families over here.
Yeah, I think that specific...
I was just going to say, actually, when Baker set up his airline, my family were ready to go back after coming here in 1952 from Guyana. That was the first time they were able to go back to Guyana on a trip, and that was 1966. And that was because they had cheap travel, that was going directly to Guyana.
That could make that difference.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's my dad, by the way.
Yes, I know, proud daughter.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that portion of the book really highlights the difference in the time you've migrated as well. I think the earlier migrants really had this idea that they were going to go home, much like a lot of migrants that come to the UK in general. There's always this kind of notion, and we instill it in our kids of, you're going home, that is your home. This isn't your home, that is your home. And more often than not, they never actually end up going home. And I think it highlights it in a sense of I think it was Galahad that was saying that there's no prospects there. I remember hearing stories of family in Guyana saying, don't come back. Like, you have much better chances staying there than coming back here. And that's kind of how my family stayed in the UK. So I think it's definitely a resemblance of two different types of migrants in two different periods of time, although close together in the same era, but two very different points in time. And like you said, in terms of people from the Caribbean going to New York, Florida, Toronto, Canada, it's true. It's because they wanted to be able to return home and to be able to have that easy passage to go back and forth and visit family, which a lot of the people in the UK haven't been able to have. So,
my experience was I'm born and bred in Britain, and my parents would do the thing like, you're British, you're not Jamaican, and they weren't having none of the patois business. You're not taking it. And so it's very much always a Queen's English, and this is your birth country. So it's like, for them, whether they intended, although my mother did go back sort of 20 years ago, I don't know if they actually, and that was probably because she had arthritis. I don't know whether she planned to pack up and leave her children, apart from the weather thing is a big thing, the heat. But for my dad, his experience, he never ever talked about or mentioned racism at all. So we're children that were never prepared for it. Now, the first person that said something to me about racism was when I was like 18, and it was a white person, my sociology teacher. She goes, Carol, you're going to have to work twice as hard as everyone else because, you're going to be treated. And I just ignored this woman. And what was she saying? Because I hadn't had any of these issues or problems. I mean, because I grew up in Tottenham where, kids used to bash each other a bit, but there were skinheads, but it wasn't a deep thing. I think we used to look at it more like maybe white people want to bash black people, or there were black skinheads as well that used to wear them. So it wasn't a big issue race until probably we started coming out of school and the jobs. And then you started to feel like, what's going on? And the things did change in the 80s, because you could even go down like Tottenham High Road in the 70s. Never see a black person in any shop. They didn't. The only black people you saw in the shop were the ones that owned their Caribbean shop. And that was it. When I left school, literally, for a lot of the guys, the young black guys, if your dad had a job, he'd have to get you a job. There was no jobs for you to go to, especially if you're not very well educated. There was no opportunities. It started to come in the 80s when they established the Commission for Racial Equality. even some other white people, when I used to work in Haringey, said to me, if you lived in Tottenham, you'd never get a job. Your postcode would get you a job. You would not get a job with your Tottenham postcode. And because it was predominantly then a black area, because I think in the 70s, the white people would start moving out to places like Peterborough and Milton Keynes. So it was quite different. And the thing about, it's quite common. Everyone had a bath once a week, sorry. And if your bath got broken, your gas, you had to go to the public baths. You had to go to the public baths with these great big baths. It was like with the swimming pool. But and then my uncles all used to live around Notting Hill, so they were all involved in these riots and things. But unfortunately, they all died quite relatively young, but they never talked to us about really much about their experience. And nor did my dad. We're trying to trace this. It seems like he came, and when he came, there were still ration books. But my dad had been one of these adventurous types, gone off to Cuba, gone off to America, worked in America during the war, doing some farming things. But he never even talked about racism and things when he'd been there working either. So he'd gone to these places and came here. And he used to Hackney and Stepney. It was.
Thanks, Carol. But I think there's some commonality in that, because many parents shielded their children from what they had to face on a daily basis. I think for me, one of the things that really stands out going to school in the 70s was Roots. The Roots, because when Roots happened, the temperature in the playground just went off the scale, just in terms of how many of the children, ourselves really, in terms of black children from the African diaspora, reacted to every white kid in the playground. And I always find that, and it sticks in my mind, because you had this microcosm of different groups fighting each other based on this TV program, and it always emphasises to me how powerful the media is in the absence of an opportunity to actually have dialogue. So I think just before we close, I'd really like to hear from the panel around your thoughts on how communities created and continue to create home here. Because as you said, some people went home, our parents, ourselves had a particular experience, but many of us are still here. Many of us are grandparents ourselves. Just your thoughts on that.
I'd like to say, I think a lot of our community benefited from the legacy left by Windrush generation, and a lot of people have done very, very well. And I think right now, a lot of people are looking to leave. A lot of people have left. And then with this corona thing going on and lockdown, some people have lost what little they had, in terms of savings. But and a lot of people, I think, are thinking, well, there's no point staying here now. It's all over, So I think a lot of people are shipping out. But I have to say, the younger generation seems to be getting on with things. I think see a lot of creativity, a lot of young entrepreneurs, and simply that's the legacy of the Windrush generation going forward.
The legacy being our young people.
Yeah.
That's lovely. Jana?
I think for the Indo-Caribbean community had a bit of a rough time establishing themselves for a long time. Like I said, due to isolation, they kind of began to do institutionalized activities, which kind of kept a sense of community. But it was only in a very minority, growing up in the Indo-Caribbean mosque, I didn't even realize that there was any other type of Indo-Caribbean. I've just thought, oh yeah, that's just them, that's it. And then it was only branching out and kind of joining a wider sense of community that I realized, well, there's nuances. There's Hindu Indo-Caribbeans, Christian Indo-Caribbeans, there's mixed I'm mixed, so there's mixed Indo-Caribbeans. And I didn't even realize that I'm a part of a much wider community. And I think, like you said, now with the younger generation, we have that sense of wanting to feel like we're home. I was on a podcast the other week and someone asked me, do you feel like you're embraced here and belonged here? And it's sad to say, but not entirely. But I think my community helps me realize that, your ancestors earned the right to be here. And your ancestors contributed heavily to this country, to the rebuilding of this country when it needed it. So now I think community is really starting to establish. There's a huge Indo-Caribbean network online now with social media. We're connecting with people from Canada, the US, people still in the West Indies. And I think now that our community is starting to be established, we're looking kind of more to figuring out how we can have more ways of representation. Because I think that's something that's lacked in the Indo-Caribbean community, is that we just don't have representation. It was very common of like our elder generations to kind of keep your head down, just keep working, don't make any noise. Much like the comment of how your parents didn't talk to you about racism. It was really like that, and kids were like to be seen and not heard. And so now it's kind of more about establishing those areas of representation so that the next generation can have some sort of reference to what their community looks like.
I'm reminded of the fact that, because you talked about how do you create a home, I think one of the things people did is they actually bought their own home. That was like one of the first things they do to establish themselves as a community, to actually physically own your premises and therefore be able to do your own thing and not be harassed by landlords. So you'd buy your own property, and then you try to replicate as much as your life in the Caribbean as you possibly could over here. So that's how come you got development of black hairdressers in certain areas and Caribbean takeaways, and also restaurants. So think about the Mangrove. Mangrove used to be in Notting Hill, and that was Frank Critchlow trying to recreate a piece of Trinidad in London. And it wasn't just him who did that. Other people did the same sort of thing when it came to having a restaurant or some sort of business or even a bread shop, because bread shops are a big part of Caribbean lifestyle. If you've been there, you know that, right? So businesses were part of it, also churches too. And because there was discrimination in the kind of the regular Protestant or Church of England or Catholic Church, people began to have their own churches, which would initially start off in someone's front room or their bedroom, and then it just get bigger and bigger. Now there is a number of huge majority black churches. You got KICC, you got Victory, well not Victory, that's gone now, but there's a whole bunch of them. So that's another aspect to kind of trying to keep your culture alive, is having your own home, your own business, your own way of worshiping or spirituality, etc. And also music, which you mentioned already, and also writing. So that brings us back to the book.
Brings us back to the book, and I think there's that whole thing about kind of, when I look at it in terms of where we are now, is that the sort of the generations that I see in my family, it's really interesting because when people go to the Caribbean, they don't necessarily go to Jamaica, which is where our family's from. People are much freer to go to any island. I have to say I'm one of those. Any island and feel at home, but still very close to the heart, the place where my parents come from. And then I see the multiple identities that many of our young people have, because of either it's familial, because that there are multiple heritages in families, multiple island experiences, but actually there are some who are very close to relatives in the States, relatives at different parts of Africa. So I think when we talk about trying to define sort of the home post-Windrush and the children of the children of the children of the Windrush, I hate this term melting pot, but it's very hard to define a single identity. It's very hard to define a single identity, but there are common threads that bring people together. So we've come to the end of our exploration. We started off with Samuel Selvon. If you haven't read it, please read the book. And even when there's a Jamaican character speaking and it sounds as if they've got a Trinidadian lilt, just go with it. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter at all. And there's lots of really great books out there. Those books here in the library, if you want to explore more about writers, in particular of the Windrush generation, City Lit in central London are running, I think it's an online course of writers of the Windrush generation, and that's kicking off in August. And please do keep tuned into our big Books and Beyond season, because I'm sure over the coming months there'll be lots of things for you to check into. So I'd just like to thank Moira, who's our head of service, Nikki, who's wandering around there in the background, our events team, who are all busy at various desks with bits of kit, making sure that this is televised and audible, and just to thank everyone who's watching from home and everyone who's here, and of course our fantastic panel, if you'd just like to show your appreciation. So thank you. Are you going to close us out?
Yes, I'll play you out.
Yeah, thank you.
But don't let me rush you out.
Thanks, Ray.
Please come and have another drink.
Thanks, Ray Carlos, everybody.
online, so if you look for it, you're going to enjoy it. Albums of Victor Romero and many others. And we're going to use this as a vehicle to raise some cash for St. Vincent, people of St. Vincent. And this is a song that you all know. It's a song by Omar. It's called There's Nothing Like